Milwaukee Public Television is proud to present Next Avenue Community Conversations. Next Avenue brings baby boomers and beyond smart, useful information and compelling perspectives. Our goal is quite simple, to provide provocative information that makes your life more meaningful and enjoyable. Next Avenue is made possible with funding from the Helen Daniels Bader Fund, a Bader philanthropy, enhancing the quality of life of older adults and addressing issues affecting those with Alzheimer's disease. On this episode, how traveling through time and learning about history can both enlighten and enrich in who we are today. We are coming to you from the incredibly popular and recently reimagined Streets of Old Milwaukee exhibit at the Milwaukee Public Museum. Now here's your host, Mark Sechrets.
There certainly is a lot more to history than just keeping a great collection of dusty old books. For those of us who truly embrace it, truly embrace our love of history, it lives and breathes within the depths of our soul, creating a curiosity for where we live, what we do as people, and how we reach out to others. And when we're here appreciating exhibits like the Streets of Old Milwaukee, it draws us in, revives us, help us better understand the moment in which we live, and to some extent, help us anticipate what we are to face in the future. We're celebrating history here on this edition of Next Avenue Community Conversation, and our two special guests certainly throughout their professional lives have learned to help us better understand where we live and our neighbors around us and what the future may hold by creating a living and breathing historical presentation for us on virtually a daily basis. We are joined by John Gurda, my longtime friend here at Milwaukee PBS and colleague. He is a historian, author, and television producer. And we're also joined by Muchka, curator of history collections for the Milwaukee Public Museum. Let's give them a round of applause and welcome them to our conversation here this evening. So good to be with you guys, and you really do make history come alive for us on a daily basis. Why is it important? I'm going to toss this out to both of you, and I love you to dialogue between the two of you on this opening question. Why is it so important for those of us who live and work here and raise our families here to truly have an appreciation for our regional history? John?
I think the way I define history very simply is it's why things are the way they are. So just as each of us has a history that is all the past experience we've had that led us to the present moment we're in, our communities have as well, and unless you know what that path has been, it's impossible to know exactly where you are or where you're going as well. It's become kind of a standing joke on the Around the Corner show. I'm the guy on the bike who kind of rides up and talks about the area's history when we do all the shows with John McGivern. And the role that water plays in so many communities, whether it's water power, where a river has even a modest fall, or a port potential on a lake. So Menominee Falls, Oak Creek, West Bend, Whitewater, Wisconsin Rapids becomes almost the same story. But you have to know that creation story to understand why all those communities, why all our communities began and how they've changed over the years. So that to me is fundamental, knowing where things began, and that kind of plants the stake to see how things have changed from then. Because history basically is the study of change. You begin at one point and things continue to evolve, and it will continue in all the decades to come as well.
Mr. Muchka, your thoughts on that? As we're looking at redeveloping the harbor district itself these days, so water certainly is an ongoing topic for Greater Milwaukee.
Exactly. Things like water. One of the biggest things that impacts people in their history in a place are the usable resources. So these are the things that become very, very important to us over the course of the years, whether it's water for sewage removal, water for manufacturing, grain and food that grows in and around your local communities so that you can keep a healthy community as well. That was one of the big things that the health department started in the late 1890s, the idea of healthy food that was going into the people in the community, especially the children. So all of these little building blocks, and to me, history is local building blocks. It's piece by piece by piece. It all comes together and creates the edifice of our history and our place.
John, in addition to water, historically when we're looking at the development of our greater community, what are some of the other essential things that someone living in current day really needs to know about the past to thrive here?
First of all, Mark, Al talked about local building blocks, and I think that's really key.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, and I did not come to the love of history until I was out of college, history was usually taught as something that happened someplace else. Valley Forge, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., the West Coast. It was never local. It was never our story. And my own feeling is that all history is local history in that it only becomes important when it becomes part of our daily lived realities, whether it's the Depression back in the 30s or the election that we just went through. So in that sense, it really is important to kind of hone in on our story and kind of own that story. In terms of where Milwaukee came from, certainly it's foundational that we have the best natural harbor on the western shore of the lakes. That's why Milwaukee is here. And then you look at the role that ethnicity has played here over the years. We are a globally diverse city. In the early years, we were a European diverse city. And some people sometimes ask what makes Milwaukee different. And I always say three things: Germanism, socialism, and beer. And they're all related. So you look at a city that the area today, it's about 38% Germanic in its ethnic stock, which is the highest proportion in the U.S. And that goes a long way toward explaining some of not just the street signs, all the SCH names you see in Milwaukee, but kind of the patterns and folkways that are here as well. So we've become much more diverse than that. We're not all using our elves, and you have a using your shop here on the streets of Old Milwaukee, but no, that is foundational for Milwaukee.
Once one understands the history of where he or she lives, then how do you apply it? Socially, economically, at the workplace, in the schools, how do you apply it on an everyday basis, make it relevant?
Well, for the museum, one of the big things is, and what our charter was really about, was providing a place for the people of Milwaukee, and especially for the children of Milwaukee. This place was built to educate. So what we wind up doing over the last 140 years, essentially, is bringing the world to Milwaukee. But, you know, in some ways, the world was already here with all of the different people that came here. And when you look at the pieces, the things, the objects that they brought with them, you see that in a place like the Streets of Old Milwaukee here. And we rebuild those lives and those ideas. And what that comes down to is really being able to show everyone where Milwaukee began and its direction over the course of the 19th and early 20th century.
And your streets under your direction, the direction of your colleagues, has gone under a recent restoration. Tell us about that, and what are some of your favorite parts of the exhibit as it now stands, Al?
Well, last year, the Streets of Old Milwaukee turned 50 years old. So as part of that, we really did decide that we were going to freshen it up, make a change, bring it kind of back into, you know, a vogue again. But, you know, what we found out was it was never out of vogue. When we mentioned that we were going to make some changes, there was a hue and cry. People did say, don't change our streets. We did take that to heart, and we really did keep the basic footprint of the streets. But what we added were a few new objects, some ideas that went into some new technology. We've written several apps now that we're using so that people can tour the streets on their own and actually get a guided tour by a character we developed. Matter of fact, I just finished working on the Christmas app, and Granny will be your guide. So that's going to be a very interesting little situation. But in that, we bring together Milwaukeeisms, but we also then talk about the idea of an American Christmas and all the bits and pieces from Europe and other places in the world that come together here to make that Christmas. So we do build.
Did you consider, Al, having Kitty Williams do the guiding?
I thought about it, but it might be just a little too cold for her to be outside.
She ran one of the more famous brothels in Milwaukee, so has a presence here.
You know, as we tour the streets of Old Milwaukee and we think about what daily life was like for the shopkeepers, for the founding shopkeepers, has life changed that much for the shopkeepers today in Wisconsin Avenue?
Oh, sure, they're all digital.
But I mean, in terms of critical thinking, survival.
No, they're all, certainly all the businesses here on the streets of Old Milwaukee, they face the same problems that people do today. And as we were talking about earlier, you have to adapt not just to survive, but to thrive. You've got to keep on adapting to your market, keep on changing. And that is no different when you had ink nib pens and green shades, green visors and armbands, doing your accounts to the digital area of today. It's the same dynamic, certainly, trying to make sure you're doing the best for your customer. Mm-hmm. To your earlier point, Mark, about how you apply history, why it's important in the present, a couple things come to mind. One is perspective. We've just been through a bruising election, and it helps to go back in time to the 19th century when people were being just as nasty to each other on the campaign trail as they have been in the last several months. Mm-hmm. I was working in the last month or so on a column about politics, and you come across charges of people being whiffling, hypocritical pimps and impotent imbeciles. Those sort of things were sort of bandied about pretty casually. So in that sense, nothing has changed in terms of the tone of civil discourse. Sometimes I think people kind of look back at the past as sort of this city on a hill, golden era, good old days. It was never the case. No, we've always had kind of this blend of darkness and light and yin and yang, and that history teaches that. That's a very important thing to teach.
I know that you've given a lot of thought to that because I really enjoyed your essay in the Milwaukee Journey Sentinel a few weeks ago when you took a solo trip to the UP and you were thinking about this.
Yes.
And you were describing the historical significance of the natural landscape and how the natural landscape does not change in the great wild, in parts of the UP at least. It remains constant, which sort of serves as a refuge for giving historical perspective for what's going on in the world.
A refuge, Mark, and a context, a sense of perspective. The world will be here long after Hillary and Donald are footnotes in some 23rd century history texts. And something else history teaches is that because our time here is so short, because life is so evanescent, so ephemeral in a lot of ways, it's our obligation to make sure that we see ourselves in this long chain of generations, to have a sense of our linkage with generations past and a sense of responsibility to generations moving forward. I think that's really key. And history does that. History makes those connections.
Do you take the same refuge from time to time, Al, as an historian, when you're in the middle of your research, to just get away and just to, because time stops when you're in a landscape like that, doesn't it?
It does. I have a property in Marinette County that I use as a retreat, and that's where I go to kind of pull myself together and think things through. And when we were doing the Streets of Old Milwaukee revamp last year, I made it up there several times over the course of the process and was able to kind of bring myself back to reality. Sometimes when you're working on a big project and these kinds of things, you lose the perspective that John is talking about. And you have to kind of bring that back for yourself and look at the chain of events and the chain of people that really do represent Milwaukee and the city of Milwaukee, the people of Milwaukee, and all of the ideas that flowed through them. One of the big things that just impresses me so much about the Streets of Old Milwaukee, now think about this, I'm like the 4th or 5th curator that's overseen this area, but it never ceases to amaze me when I see this intergenerational back and forth that you wind up having between grandparents and their grandchildren, and their teachers and the parents and the children that come here, and the ideas that are exchanged. They look in the windows and they ask, Mom, what is this about? Grandpa, what is this about? And you get that first-hand knowledge, that passing the torch kind of thing. Even though that little object in the window is no longer made, it doesn't exist in anyone's home anymore, except as possibly an antique. But that intergenerational interaction really does bring it home, and it allows the young to learn from the old. And that's the greatest thing about the museum and the Streets of Old Milwaukee especially.
I love that as well. It is an immersive experience. It's kind of a time capsule, taking us back to an earlier time. And that's also something that history teaches when, I'm sure Al felt the same thing, when you're really immersed in research, in the same way that travel is broadening, and we encourage our kids to go elsewhere to see that this is not just, the world around them is not just all that exists. The same thing is true in terms of history. Sometimes we can be so immersed in our own times that it seems like nothing else outside has relevance. when you're really in the throes of deep research, you sort of find yourself almost sinking down, you know, into the layers of the past and feeling yourself to be kind of walking around like the streets of old Milwaukee, but pretty much in your head, you know, kind of doing all that kind of research. I spent the afternoon working on a chapter for a book about Milwaukee built on water, talking about our maritime history, and talking about the schooners and steamships that called here. There were more of them calling into Milwaukee back in the 1870s than there are airplanes who come into Mitchell every day.
That's an amazing statement. That really is.
To move down into that and really sense, you know, the role that water played here. We talked about water earlier, but the sense that the economy was so different back in those years, but in other ways very much the same, you know, exchanging ideas, exchanging people, exchanging goods. So that, I think, it helps to build a sense of perspective and to destroy a sense of kind of the privileged notion of the present. This is just one moment that we're in, and it's just in a long, long continuum of other moments.
Absolutely. You know, you touched on something really interesting, Alan, the intergenerational family history. To what degree, when we share our family history with our children, are we stimulating a greater curiosity for world history?
I think it's probably one of the best ways to stimulate the broadest possible histories. Everyone comes from someplace. So to be able to speak about your grandparents who came from Poland or Germany, and then if you're really into it and you're getting into Ancestry and some of these other little databases that really help you understand and pull the pieces together, you can trace this back further and further and further. And now with the DNA research that goes on, and you can actually figure out what sections of the world parts of you actually come from. So it broadens you out individually through your DNA. You can see the bits and pieces. It personalizes it, and it kind of brings it home to be able to say, I have a Germanic background, or I have a Slavic background, and these are the things that are most interesting to me. And when you come to a place like this museum, our European Village is another expression of the same situation. You can see those European roots and bring that home and kind of show people how, over the course of years and over the course of generations, their families get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you really think about it, these days, the biggest claim is we're all one big family.
Yeah.
And
John, the past decade has gone by fast, and you and your co-producer colleague, Claudia Lewis, have done a brilliant job on giving us an epilogue to your epic documentary, The Making of Milwaukee, with the next chapter. When you put together that 10-year epilogue to what's happened since the initial release of your documentary, it must have felt like it just went like that.
It did. I have a friend who's retired, and he says people ask him how long ago something happened. He says, oh, about 10 years. And he said he's surprised how often he's right. And it's the same thing. It just seems like that's been kind of an eye blink since '06 when that series first came out. And certainly change is it's the way of the world, and history is the study of change, but things have certainly, the pace has accelerated. There is no news cycle anymore. You know, it's completely instantaneous. We all have instant access to everything, from knowledge to entertainment to news. So trying to isolate the themes in that really fast-moving river of events and themes was the challenge. But some certainly stand out. The ones we identified included everything from the widening social economic gap in American society as reflected in Milwaukee as well, to the fact that, you know, Milwaukee really is on a roll. You have this thicket of construction cranes in the skyline of Milwaukee. At the same time, you have neighbors nearby that are struggling. So kind of that, trying to find, you know, sort of that line between weaving through the paradoxes of contemporary American and Milwaukee society was kind of the path we chose to take, and the metaphor was bridges. You know, we filmed on bridges and we ended on a bridge, you know, trying to bridge between past and present, as well as all the divides in Milwaukee that exist today.
As you pointed out, when you were hitting hard on the divide politically, socially, economically, culturally, our founders were there once, and they were able to address that.
Streets of Old Milwaukee, we don't have Kilburn Town, Juneau Town here. The streets are not at an angle, you know, as they were in pioneer Milwaukee. But you have those East and West Sides founders who didn't get along, and they got along so poorly that they did lay out their streets independent of each other, so they now cross at an angle, but they became Milwaukee. Juneautown, Kilburntown, and Walker's Point all joined forces as one city back in 1846.
Yeah, yeah. So what could bring us closest together? Have you seen this happen historically? What can close that divide? What can close that gap as an historian, as you view it, Al?
Well, what I've noticed with a lot of neighborhoods is people, people tend to be insular. So in the neighborhoods, they kind of cook as their own little stew. But what happens is, what's really fascinating about Milwaukee especially is where the neighborhoods touch. You have these interfaces where there's just little bits of exchange. And then you have the business world where the exchange gets greater and greater and greater. And so here in Milwaukee, one of the early things that happened is a lot of these neighborhoods touching on each other would eventually be pulled into the neighborhood of an industry, something like Alice Chalmers,
yeah,
or the Reliance Works down on the Lower South Side. And people would have to go there and work, and they'd had to learn to work together. Otherwise, you didn't have a job. You needed to learn how to work within the framework of the industry. You needed to know mathematics. You needed to know language. You needed to know English to be able to speak to each other. You couldn't have one end of the shop speaking Polish and another one speaking Hungarian. So so everyone needed to work together. And that's what I see as a way of businesses to kind of bring people together and expand the way they think about each other.
So if that was working socially during Milwaukee's industrial heyday, what will replace that today for that type of interaction, sharing, team approach?
My concern, Mark, is that we've all become, as I said in the next chapter, we've become kind of kingdoms of one. We have access to the same body of information, but we kind of access it independently. So the music we listen to, the podcasts that are in our ears, kind of the channels we watch, these are things that are tailored, so it really is a kingdom of one. Trying to broaden out from that to a sense of our common, our mutual fate has become more of a challenge. But that's why I do history. Besides the fact that it's fascinating to me, I think the more you can help people understand their stories and have a sense of ownership of their stories, the more secure they are in their stories, the more curious they will be about other stories and how, as Al was saying, how those things interface and interact. So ultimately, especially on the local level, eat local, grow local, buy local, do history locally as well. The end result, I hope, is to have people have a greater sense of both ownership of their community and belonging in their community, and both are very important. History can do that.
And that's the key. You're not just historians, you're time travelers. You travel in and out of different time throughout your day of research, presentations, authorship. What is that like? One moment you're thinking one period of time in the world, maybe in the afternoon you're in a totally different place. How do you focus on whatever you're researching or presenting at the moment? Al?
Well, for me, it's taking it one bit at a time.
But do your senses draw you into it? For example, when you're walking here in the streets of Milwaukee, do you smell the bakery, the way the baker must have been like? Do you, Before they put the bakery puffer in, I smelled the bakery here. But it's one of those situations where you just have this compulsion that just makes you want to dig deeper in everything you do. For myself, one of the things, I'm not just a historian here, I just don't work with documents. I work with the objects. I work with the plans for the objects. So I need to have an understanding of the engineering. I need to have an understanding of the mathematics of how things work to be able to pull this together so that you can see why things evolve the way they evolve. Something like the typewriter. One of the things that I keep studying constantly are Scholz's patents for the typewriters.
Yes. And you have the world's best collection right here.
And we do. There's over 940 typewriters right here in this building. And one of the most beautiful Scholz and Gliddens is out in our lobby. And this is a very meaningful thing for Milwaukee. I mean, you had this man who came here from the East and lived his life here as a newspaperman, as a minor politician, but also as an inventor, someone that had a vision. And you see that with a lot of people in Milwaukee, even in small ways. I mean, But if you think about it, there is no small way. All of these ideas, all of these visions come together in the person, and history really helps you understand why these things fall into your lap or why these things come to you, and then how you can arrange them, make sense, and get the perspective that John's talking about of how I can make this better for the future.
And John, when you're researching neighborhoods and you look at a particular intersection, are you looking at it through different time levels? Are you?
It's a little different from that, Mark.
Is your perception, is it different than ours?
I'm not sure. I think a lot of people are, there are people who are either hobbyists or just have a fascination with the past. You can look at a street corner or a streetscape as kind of this layered tier of almost an archaeological dig, kind of what was here before. That's fascinating, but to me, what the historical imagination is best for is teaching you that everything is in motion and always has been in motion. We're tempted, I think, by standing here in 2016 to say, yeah, this is pretty much the way it's been for as long as I remember. But you kind of look at the longer view, it is just, it's sort of time-lapse photography that this thing's completely changing.
The motion of our fun conversation is coming to a close. How about a round of applause for our wonderful guests here? John Muchka, John Gurda. It's been wonderful. We love doing this series. I'm Mark Seegers. Thank you very much. We'll hope you join us for our next Community Conversation.